Divided and undone. Even though the enemies of this country claim a desire to unite the country and preach diversity and inclusion, they use these words to divide, not to unite. Unity is simply another term that has been redefined. The only unity they are seeking is uniformity of mind, based on what they want you to think and what they want you to do. The unity they speak of flows directly from the democracy they promote, as they are seeking uniformity in obedience to the general will, the happiness imposed on the unhappy by the all-powerful sovereign. A moral and religious people require less governmental interference in their lives. The shift in language and values and the hyperbolic level of division within culture and politics has not only created another self-sustaining feedback loop of division and declining morality feeding one another, but they are also incrementally moving people toward a desire for more and more governmental interference with their lives, leading to a decline in the desire for liberty over tyranny. The American people are clamoring for despotism because, as de Tocqueville recognized, quote, despotism often presents itself as the repairer of all the ills suffered, the support of just rights, defender of the oppressed, and founder of order, end quote. The American people want to solve the problems of poverty and oppression and unjust application of rights. They truly desire the equality of all. But instead of moving in this direction at the individual, community, and societal levels by championing the values inherent in their altruism and from a solid, proven foundation, they have allowed their minds and hearts to be shaped by the powerful elites through their hijacking and effective manipulation of a narrative created to instead divide and vilify all those different from us. And so, chipping away at the foundational pillars, the pulling of the threads, the fraying of the fabric, has been more of an unraveling of society from the inside, one thread at a time. Chapter 14, Hope and Change. The complete unraveling of society would not be possible without eliminating all those sources of moral authority found within civil society. The sovereign cannot be all-powerful without eradicating alternate sources of authority. People would not turn to the sovereign as a moral authority if they found moral authority somewhere else. Likewise, people would not turn to the sovereign as the ultimate solution to their problems if they had no problems. And the collective consciousness would be much more difficult to bend to the will of the sovereign without fear as a pervasive force. It's interesting how all these words that start with F are juxtaposed with one another in our minds. Like fear has replaced faith, as well as faith in our fellow man, and fear has been prioritized over freedom. And the collective consciousness would be much more difficult to bend to the will of the sovereign without fear as a pervasive force. Devaluing human life. In 2020, there was an assumption that every human is so valuable we need to cancel all society to avoid even a single COVID death or infection, but not valuable enough to be reasoned with or allowed the dignity of making value judgments for themselves. Replacing traditional religious institutions with linked powerful entities defining values and garnering adherence to a new religion was aided by fear. Fear of a virus and fear of dying translated into fear of your neighbor. Fear of your neighbor translated into the fearful outrightly telling people who disagreed with them to die, or wishing upon those who disagreed with them death and suffering. Yes, we came to a place in our society where the real desperation Americans found themselves in stealthily assassinated the ability to agree to disagree. It did not end with vitriolic rhetoric and online bullying either. People who did not want to wear masks shot the mask enforcers. Masked individuals beat down those without masks. Remember, masks dehumanize the wearer, just as they always have, from slave seasoning environments hundreds of years ago to the burqa in Afghanistan or the veil in Iran today. The communication obstructions and dehumanization fostered by masks also impede empathy to the point where we don't see the other as human at all. And this dehumanization necessarily leads to not valuing the life of the human being one doesn't see as human. The reaction is instead similar to taking out one's enemy in a video game. The desensitization to violence against human-like beings has occurred over time. And while most players of violent video games will not venture forth to commit violence, the concept behind the violence, whether in the game or in real life, is the same. If one doesn't see a figure as an actual person, there is no hesitancy to lash out against the non-person. No hesitancy before pulling the trigger or landing blows. This is the same devaluing of life evidenced by the results of the 2020 riots. Peaceful protesters turned into perpetrators of assault and battery, not to mention robbery, destruction of property, and even murder against businesses and individuals who stood their ground, attempted to protect their property, or who would not cave to demands. The other has no value. If they are not on your team, they deserve to be eliminated. Likewise, if one is convinced that a fetus is only a clump of cells or a part of the woman's body, that is overt dehumanization. And once something is not seen as human, it is easy on one's conscience to eliminate it. But make no mistake, abortion is taking a human life. And our country's fervor to protect the right to take that life is simply an indication of how little we now value human life. Not to mention, instead of advocating for the intrinsic value of every human being, we assign value based on whether someone is wanted or not. That is the legacy of abortion. In the case of abortion, while the fetus is by every scientific definition a unique human life, one's stance on abortion is related to when that life has value for another individual. But such value placement on human life is not limited to the unborn. This is the same value assignment those wishing death on anyone who disagrees with them uses. And most Americans are more likely to save their own pet dog than a human being if that person is a stranger. This value placement and dehumanization could also explain horrendous acts of torture against children who are not wanted by those entrusted with their care. Our dependence on emotional attachment added to the dehumanization prevalent in society today makes this make sense. This being the abandoning of the intrinsic value of a human being in favor of valuing only human lives that feed our positive emotional responses. This assigning of value based on whether someone is wanted or not could also be a factor in the increased suicide rate among young people. The victims of such suicide are evidence of this devaluing, as human lives with so much potential and intrinsic value were not thought valuable enough to save, not even by the victims themselves. Too many don't find their own lives have any value. Fear has also been utilized in the discussion of the climate crisis to get otherwise thinking individuals on board with more control over their lives. But an analysis of arguments reveals, again, an overall devaluing of human life. Why is it important to combat climate change or address the climate crisis? When framed as a national security threat or as hope for a better future for our progeny, the narrative implies that combating climate change and addressing the climate crisis is crucial to protecting and benefiting people, human lives. However, with innovation and technology reliant upon fossil fuels responsible not only for the Industrial Revolution, but for every subsequent innovation that has made life better and easier in the industrialized society, and with those advancements far outpacing any real threat from a changing climate, almost every measure introduced or suggested to combat the crisis is instead to the detriment of people, not to their benefit, leading the current rhetoric to demand a defense of the earth at the expense of the most vulnerable, including those who are not being allowed to industrialize or innovate for themselves. Human life is not being prioritized. The welfare of human beings across the globe has been deprioritized as part of the problem, and never part of the solution that has already been deployed. I don't even mention in the book the slavery used to mine the rare earth minerals required for electric vehicles, for example, but this slave labor used in mining also leads to horrendous health outcomes for those doing the mining. I also, in the book, don't mention the environmental toll these supposed green policies and solutions take on the planet they say they are trying to save. But one thing is for sure, no matter what they are saying, human life is not being prioritized. The welfare of human beings across the globe has been deprioritized as part of the problem and never part of the solution that has already been deployed.